You're listening to the Monday Night Community Show with Daniel on BRFM.
This is the Daniel Monday Night Community Show on demand through YouTube. Thank you very much for choosing to listen to us through this method. If you'd like to keep up to date with when I add new interviews, then subscribe to this channel. We're joined with Rolf now from the RSPB, and it's, as always, good to see you, because I think it's about a year or so since you were last up here, so it's good to have you back.
Yeah, no, it's great to be back.
So I was wondering if you could just give our listeners a little bit of a refresher and an introduction into your role and also the RSPB as well.
Well, yes, the Royal Society for the Protection of Birds had a very busy year once again. We've got 200 nature reserves around the United Kingdom, and of course quite a lot of them are here in the Thames Estuary. My role is to engage with local communities, ensuring they know that these reserves are there for them to use and enjoy, to help us out as well with their sighting, seeing the wildlife that's around. They're our eyes and ears as well to monitoring the health of the estuary, to come and enjoy the nature reserves, and quite a lot volunteer as well, help us to actually do the work on the ground to keep the habitat in good condition. And another part of my job is really helping to fight some of the big battles, because of course there are a lot of pressures on the Greater Thames Estuary for development in particular, and so part of my role is to talk to people about that, so that they share their views, have an opinion on the future of the marshes and this environment for themselves, and also then to talk to some of the people who have a say over what happens in the end. For example, the Davies Commission, the Airport Commission that came to visit the marshes this summer.
And I know you wanted to talk about Great Bells Farm next.
Yeah, really exciting project, a change in the landscape here on the Isle of Sheppey at Great Bells Farm, which actually sort of sits between the prisons and the Elmley marshes. And this is something which is sort of happening around the country, and it's to do with climate change, sea level rise, and the fact that one of the best defences against the sorts of storms that were so devastating in 1953, when many hundreds of people drowned in their beds during those storms, we need to protect the coast, we need to protect our cities. And one of the best things to do that is actually marshland, is natural habitat that fringes the coastline, that takes out all the energy out of these storm surges. And so the Environment Agency, the government body that's responsible for protecting us from this sort of event, are looking to put back in some of the old salt marshes along the fringes down the east coast of the UK to protect us. But of course a lot of these habitats are now protected because of their environmental value for all of the wildlife that lives there. And so if you're going to start to modify and change the coast and perhaps put a seawall in here and put a salt marsh in somewhere else, you need to make sure it all balances out. So in parts of the river where they're going to have to put seawalls in to protect us from coastal storm surges, this might mean losing some nice marshland habitat. They need to put that in somewhere else, and Great Bells Farm is an example of this. So the Environment Agency purchased the farm that had arable crops originally, and then contracted us, the RSPB, to turn that back into a nice freshwater marsh that's good for wildlife. And so that means there'll be no net loss if somewhere else in the estuary they need to lose some marshes to put in some seawalls to protect us from storm surge in that particular way. So over the last couple of years, our team have designed the new nature reserve at Great Bells Farm on a computer, using lasers flown over the ground from an aircraft to map out what the topography, the lie of the land was, to find actually some of the old existing salt marsh shapes and little rills and rivers that were there. And then designed into that on the computer the best wetland habitat for the birds that we want to bring back. And then bulldozers came down on the site over the last 18 months, and would you believe it, these bulldozers actually had GPS receivers on the front bucket, and they literally used the computer program plugged into the bulldozer, and with the GPS satellites telling the bulldozer exactly where it was at Great Bells, the driver drew into the ground the new nature reserve. And what we've now seen in the last year is it flooded up and dries down with the wet and the dry seasons. It looks exactly as we hoped it would, which is the perfect conditions for the birds to come back. And so we all win. It means Environment Agency can protect us from floods with seawalls elsewhere. We also get some freshwater marsh back in for the wildlife to return. We had a cracking year for breeding lapwing this year. And in time, not open to the public yet, but in time, once the reserve has settled in and is in really fine fettle, then we'll look to see ways in which people can go and enjoy it. But at the moment, if you go down to the Elmley Marshes Reserve, you can actually, there is a public right-of-way takes you out. You can see parts of Great Bells. So it sort of builds on some of the existing marshes we already have in the Swale Estuary.
You next wanted to cover the Elmley Nature Reserve.
Yes, absolutely fantastic place here on the Isle of Sheppey, stacked with wildlife, and especially as we get into winter now, the winter migrants are arriving, the geese, the ducks in their tens of thousands. It's going to be a superb place to visit, as it is every year. And it's a site the RSPB used to lease, and we don't anymore, so you'll notice the RSPB logos have gone. We've moved next door into Great Bells Farm, and the Elmley Conservation Trust, who own the site, have taken on the full management of it and all the surrounding land that was always in their care. So it's still a nature reserve. The hides are still open. Still encourage everyone to get along and visit the nature reserve, and they've got their own new website as well, which I think is elmleynaturereserve.org.uk. If you Google them, you'll be able to find it. But what's great about this is that what everyone who's into conservation in the UK has realised with the threats to our wildlife that I'll talk about shortly, is that having little isolated nature reserves dotted around isn't going to be the whole answer to trying to reverse these declines in nature. What we need to do is try and fill in the gaps between them. So the RSPB couldn't do that all on its own. The Wildlife Trust couldn't do it on its own. We need to work in partnership. And particularly we need to work with other farmers, other landowners, people's gardens, schools, playing fields. If we all do a little bit, it starts to join up the bits and pieces that were the good spots for nature into joined up areas that wildlife can enjoy and indeed move through. So birds can fly somewhere new if they're losing their homes, but if you're a little invertebrate who's got to walk to the next good bit of habitat, how are you going to do it? And so this is the approach that we're taking, and the Thames Estuary is one of the most important places for joining up the habitat. So it works as a whole unit so that the birds have lots of different places to go to feed as they need to through the winter or to breed, and as climate changes through the coming decades, they can move with those changes. So this is a fantastic example of a landowner who's actually historically always been very conscious about farming for wildlife, helping to fill in the gaps, which means we can take our resources elsewhere and add to the jigsaw puzzle. So this is happening throughout the Thames Estuary. It's a new approach to wildlife conservation, to think on this landscape scale, and that for each of us, whether it's in a small way or on a big scale like at Elmley, it is going to make a difference. So really exciting times. Elmley Marshes, as I say, still there for everyone to come and enjoy and bird watch and see the water voles and everything else that's around, and we're coming into one of the best times of year to get down there and see that wildlife.
And I know next you wanted to cover the nature report, I understand.
Yeah, very, very important report was published this May, and it was launched at the Natural History Museum by Sir David Attenborough, and it's called The State of Nature. And this was put together by 25 different research organisations looking at the wildlife in the UK, so not just the RSPB but the Wildlife Trust, British Trust for Ornithology, a whole range, looking at all creatures, not just birds but mammals, insects, flowers, to see how's the country doing. And they looked at several thousands, actually over 3,000 different species, to see whether they were doing better, staying the same, or in decline. And what they discovered was, of those 3,000 species selected, that 60% of them were in really quite serious trouble. So that was really telling us in an objective way, based on the best available science, that we need to do something about the variety of wildlife, what we call the biodiversity in the UK. Otherwise, this nosedive is going to continue. And you might say, well, why does that matter? We need development, we need industry. We live in a partly industrial landscape here in the estuary. You see the chimneys around you. We've got the docks at Sheerness and elsewhere. So we need new homes for people, so surely people must come before the wildlife. But of course it's also an agricultural landscape, and one of the easiest ways to describe this important relationship we have with nature is the bees, and they are our pollinators. We're in the Garden of England, we're in Kent, so those apples in the orchards or the vineyards, many of the crops, if there aren't the insects to pollinate them, then we won't bear the produce from those crops. In other ways, the landscape helps us, whether it's capturing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere in peat bogs, whether it's marshes which help to purify water. These are all important services that help us enrich our lives and our quality of life. So we're always inextricably linked to the landscape, and you just go shopping and buy your food and drink and you're reminded of that. So ensuring that, for example, we can protect crops from diseases and that we have new strains of crops that can fight off natural diseases. Those new crops come from the wild. They come from natural grass species, related crops growing in the wild. So losing our biodiversity, our mix of nature, will be a bad thing for us. And so this report has finally given us a finger on the pulse of how nature's doing in the country, and what it said is we need to do something about this. So Elmley Conservation Trust, Great Bells Farm, our other reserves, 17 of them on the estuary here, the RSPB, Natural England Reserves, Wildlife Trust, it's all part of the solution. And as I described, each of us with our gardens, having that variety of native species, feeding the birds, making homes for hedgehogs, can all make a difference. And so we're really calling, the RSPB is calling for people to give nature a home, to think about what you can do. Might seem small, but actually to that hedgehog it's really significant. To the winter birds, feeding them in the next few months, really significant. And you scale that all the way up to understanding that we're losing things like water voles and dragonflies and birds and bats, foxes, badgers, all sorts of different species, and doing the right things to hang on to them will be good for nature, but of course it will also enrich our lives.
I know you next wanted to cover the Thames Estuary Airport.
Well, it rambles on, doesn't it? Yes, it's in the news just about every week at the moment, and it's really just to let people know that Sir Howard Davies and members of the Aviation Commission came to visit the marshes back in June, and they were hosted by Medway Council, and they also came up onto the Hoop Peninsula next door to see the marshes and talk to us at the RSPB about the impact a potential airport would have in this area. So it was excellent to be able to show Sir Howard how close we were to the 250,000 people in Medway towns, to Sheerness, to Southend, that unlike Boris's opinion that we're in the middle of nowhere and no one would be affected by these aircraft on these 4 runways, that actually it's very busy with people, and of course also that it's very busy with wildlife and stacks of birds. And just in the last week we've had 10,000 dunlin, a small wader, arrive at our RSPB Cliff Pools Reserve. So the winter waders are returning to the marshes, and there will be up to 300,000 of them by the time we get into January and February. So they certainly listened and took that on board. They were amazed by the diversity in the landscape, the number of people here, the amount of activities, from the grade 1 agricultural land to the wildlife reserves to the industry, of course all the facilities at Grain with the deep water port and the gas terminals, and ironically the aviation storage at Grain that goes off to Gatwick and Heathrow, all of which would have to move. But then looking out into the estuary as well, one might think, well, stick the airport out on an island, that won't damage anything. But again, good news for the environment. In the last month, the government has declared its first marine conservation zones. One of those is the whole of the Medway Estuary. It's recognised now how important that is for marine life. And another one in Kent, there were 3 in Kent, one's down at Folkestone, the other one's the Thanet coast. So again, a rich marine community out there that you wouldn't want to smack an airport on top of, not least because it would destroy the fisheries that so many people's livelihoods depend on in this area, particularly the blue mussel beds, which themselves become homes for all sorts of other marine creatures. And it recognised on the Thanet coast that some of these reefs offshore are coastal protection against some of the storm surges that I began this evening talking about, that 53 flood. So again, doing something for people besides also for nature in many different ways. So we're waiting now in the next couple of weeks. We expect the Davies Commission to give its interim report and tell us what it thinks are definitely things that shouldn't happen, places that are really bad for an airport, and we're hoping that the Thames Estuary will be recognised as not the place for an airport. But sadly then we will have to wait until 2015 before the Commission finally makes gives its advice and proposal to the government as to where this aviation expansion should go. And at the moment they are erring towards saying yes, we do need to increase aviation capacity, so they're looking to see where they can squeeze it in. That is slightly disappointing because we're not convinced actually that need will be there in the future.
And I was just wondering, before you go, if you could just go over any useful contact details or anything you'd just like to refresh our listeners on.
Certainly. Well, so it's been a good year for breeding birds at Great Bells Farm. That habitat's in place and working, and that's just one of the examples of the way we work with agencies like the Environment Agency and flood defence, doing well for nature and protecting us. rspb.org.uk on the website you can read more about Great Bells. Elmley Nature Reserve, still there, going great guns, so do get along and visit. This is an exciting time of year to go and see nature. So again, if you just search Elmley Nature Reserve, you'll get their new website, find out the latest of what's happening, and also search for State of Nature Report. You can download a free PDF that will tell you all about how nature's doing in the UK, and it's got some positive steps as well as things that are happening. So it's not all bad news, there's some good news in there as well. Find out how we're doing something about the challenges for nature in the UK at this time. And it's broken down into England, Scotland and Wales as well, so you can get just the bit of the report that interests you. And then watch the news the next couple of weeks. We should hear from the Davies Commission, find out what's happening with the airport so far, and where they're leaning towards development, if it has to be, where they think the best options will be, or they might start to rule out some of the places. And we hope very keenly that they will have listened to us and recognise the importance of the Thames Estuary for wildlife and for people, and that it's the wrong place for an airport. And as we come into the winter, then we just ask people to think about the wildlife in their homes and gardens, do something for wildlife, give nature a home, feed the birds if you can. We'll have got the Big Garden Birdwatch coming up in January, which is your chance to let us know what you're seeing, which is part of that really important national monitoring. Again, finger on the pulse for how wildlife is doing, and that's something everyone can get involved with. Christmas is coming up. I think it's a great time to think about if you want to join the RSPB or give it as a gift membership, then we couldn't do any of this work without our membership. So all the work we've managed to do so far is very much thanks to the support that we have. So for those members out there, thank you very much. Thanks to all the volunteers who work on the marshes with us to make it such a special place for nature. And for those who haven't thought about it, then do get online, have a look at the work of the RSPB and see if it's something that you want to join in with us. So just always wonderful to come back onto the Isle of Sheppey and see what's happening here, and especially at this time of year. So I encourage everyone to wrap up warm, get out and enjoy seeing the geese and the owls and the swans coming to visit us for this winter.
Well, I'd like to thank you very much for coming along. It's always good to have you here at BRFM. Thank you very, very much.
Pleasure to be here.
That's Rolf right here at BRFM 95.6 this evening from the RSPB. And of course, if you'd like to have a look at their website, there's a link on the blog. All you need to do is just Google Daniel Monday Night Community Show on BRFM. We have a clubs, groups, societies and useful links page on our website at brfm.net, and I think listed in there is the RSPB's website as well.